Okay, the appointed hour has arrived. Call meeting to order. We have roll call members, please.
Sure. I'll start with Mr. Conrad,
Yes.
Mr. Russo,
Present.
Mr. Smith,
Here.
and Mr. Amos.
Present. Okay, for the minutes from the April 25th, 2023 meeting, accept the motion to accept the minutes, approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second? Second. To move and second to approve the minutes. All in favor, signify by saying aye. 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 Okay, we have one case tonight. There are two variances asked, and in standard procedure, we will accept the one variance discussed and vote on one variance at a time. So in BZA 2023-3, the first at code section 1151.05A1A, wall or outstanding tree sign only. I would accept the motion to move to adjudication, please.
Motion.
Second. Seconded, motion been seconded to move to adjudication. So we will move to adjudication. Mr. Moore, you're presenting for the city.
I am.
Please raise your right hand. Swear to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth, the matters before this board.
I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, board members. So it's been a while since we've met, actually, so it's good to be with you again. This is case number 3 of the year, BZA 2023-03. There are two variances being requested. Both have to do with the same sign that is being proposed at 16 South Campus Avenue. And these have to do with sign type and the height of the sign from the ground. The applicant is JG Jewelry LLC under care of Genevieve Gerrans, who is with us tonight. The property owner is the Interfaith Center, represented by Carrie Cisna. The zoning classification that's applicable to the property is RO Office Residential District. It also falls within the University Historic District overlay. And I will mention that this particular sign that is before you tonight has already received its certificate of appropriateness approval from the Historic Commission. So from a design standpoint, the sign has already been approved from that perspective. The current usage of the property, it's a variety of different uses, nonprofit, residential, so more or less a mixed use structure. And again, the proposal, it's a sign, and this would be for a new tenant within the building, the College Artisans Shop. And once again, the variances are for sign type and sign height from ground. Here's a look at the location aerial. So campus is off to the east, the right-hand side of the map here. This is South Campus Avenue. This is 16 South Campus. This is East Walnut down here to the south and East High up to the north. And here's a look at the zoning classifications within the area. Within the block itself, there is UP zoning that is off to the north and to the west. And this is within the RO Office Residential District, which is primarily functioning like a transition district that allows for some commercial usage, some residential usage as it transitions away from uptown and into more purely residential districts. Here is a look at the bird's eye view of the property. So here's the structure right here. And here are some recent site photos, and actually there is a temporary banner that has been posted up on the porch, and I think that is pretty well equivalent to the size that is proposed, so this gives you a pretty good idea of what would result if the sign were approved to be installed as presented. There also is an Interfaith Center sign that's around the corner on this newer portion of the building in the back. There used to be a sign up here on the porch that no longer exists. And there's also another tenant within the building, Oxford Citizens for Peace and Justice. So there already is a hanging sign there that's grandfathered in. And then here is a look at the before and after conditions. So measuring the height from ground, I think it ended up being 7 feet. I think it is what the, yep, 7 feet from the porch floor, so measuring from here to here is 7 feet. The usual standard is a minimum of 9 feet. It has to be somewhere within 9 to 18 feet. If you were to measure from the ground at porch level, kind of going up through the steps and up to the top of the sign, I think at that point it'd just be a hair below 9 feet. And looking at the next slide, this is a close-up of the sign as it's presented. So this is totaling 16 inches in height by 65 inches in overall width. So it's a little over 7 square feet. So size-wise, it's perfectly fine and complies with the size restriction for the RO district. There would be content on both sides of the sign that would differ depending on whether you're entering the building or exiting. So as you're exiting, it would say, "Thank you, come again." And then, of course, facing outward, it's going to convey the tenant, the College Artisans Shop. So looking at the relevant code provisions, these are out of the zoning code. This is section 1151, which is the signage chapter. So this is the definition of a wall sign. And I'll go ahead and read this paragraph verbatim. So it's a sign painted or fixed flat against the wall of a building or structure or a marquee, awning, or canopy in such a manner that the wall becomes the supporting structure for or forms the background surface of the sign, and that does not project more than 16 inches from such building or structure. So the main provision that this particular sign cannot comply with has to do with being affixed flat against the wall of a building or structure. So these types of signs are pretty common in the uptown area. As you can imagine, most commercial tenants have that wall sign right above their storefront. And so these code stipulations are really written for that type of situation and not really anticipating this type of historical context with the porch and having a hanging sign. So we consider the proposed sign to be a hanging sign, which the zoning code does not specifically define. The closest resembling definition would be for a projecting sign, which is not expressly allowed by the code. And really the threshold for determining whether it's wall sign versus projecting sign is that 16-inch projection. So if you have more than 16 inches kind of coming out perpendicular to the building wall, then it's a projecting sign, it's prohibited. If you're 16 inches or less, then it's considered a wall sign. And I just found these images online. I just thought it would be helpful to kind of illustrate the various types of signs that are possible in any given commercial district. So you've got your more, shall we say, Oxford conventional uptown wall signs that are affixed flat against the wall of the building. With the hanging sign, it's kind of in the same sort of dimension in terms of the dimensional plane where it's positioned. It just happens to be hanging from a ceiling as opposed to being attached on a wall. Projecting signs, however, those are extending outward from the building facade, and they can be both hanging as well as non-hanging. So just keep that in mind, that hanging sign it's not necessarily mutually exclusive when it comes to projecting versus wall signs. Okay, some other relevant code provisions. So this is out of 1151.05A1, and this is technically the section that you would be potentially granting variances from tonight. So these are the standards that are applicable for the RO residential office district. So the first variance is for signage type. So it lists in A and B. These are the only types of signs that are allowed in this district, wall signs and freestanding. The closest sign type that this is equivalent to, of course, would be a wall sign. It's nowhere even close to being a freestanding sign. So the first variance would be for the sign type to allow for a hanging sign instead of a wall sign. And the second variance assumes granting of the first variance, and this would be to allow for the attachment to be 7 feet from the porch floor as opposed to meeting the minimum of 9 feet from the floor. Okay, and I'll conclude with the decision criteria, so I'll go through those one by one as I usually do. So criterion A is whether the property in question will yield reasonable return or whether there can be any beneficial use of the property without the variance. We find this supports granting the variance. Signage is a natural desire for any business looking to attract customers to its location, as well as for a property owner or landlord looking to attract commercial tenants. The architectural character of this building does not lend itself well to the installation of wall signage that is fully in compliance with code requirements, thereby possibly hindering the ability to install any kind of signage directly onto the building unless variances are considered. The inability to provide suitable signage could indirectly affect the ability for the property owner to attract tenants and thus yield reasonable return. So for these reasons, we find that criterion A supports the variance. B, we find this supports the variance. This is whether the variance is substantial. The proposed sign is essentially being hung instead of being installed flat against a wall, but otherwise does not project more than that 16-inch threshold perpendicular to the side of the building. A height of 7 feet would also leave ample room for most individuals to ascend those steps and enter the building. Criterion C supports the variance. This is whether the essential character of the neighborhood would be substantially altered or whether adjoining properties would suffer a substantial detriment. We believe the proposed sign would complement the historic character of the building and the neighborhood. And once again, the sign has already received its COA approval from the Historic Commission. Criterion D is whether the variance would adversely affect the delivery of governmental services. We do not believe it's going to negatively affect these services, so we find that this supports the variance. Criterion E supports the variance. This is whether the property owner purchased the property with knowledge, and in their letter, I believe the future tenant states that neither they nor the property owner had prior awareness of this restriction. Criterion F is whether the property owner's predicament feasibly can be obviated through some method other than a variance. We would agree with the applicant's assessment that a future sign which does not require a variance would not be as identifiable, visible, or suited to the property, so we find this supports the variance. On to letter G, this is whether the spirit and intent behind the requirement would be observed and substantial justice done. We find that this supports the variance. So the zoning code currently hampers the ability to install signage which is hung or projects from commercial buildings in the historic core area. And this regulatory decision, this is more than likely was reactionary to signage clutter that was possibly present along these corridors many years ago, which has since largely disappeared. Going down High Street has a very flat sort of appearance when it comes to signage. So I think in the future we could definitely consider amending the zoning code, possibly as part of our zoning code modernization next year, to consider maybe loosening up the restrictions. But if controlled properly, we believe such forms of signage can actually become positive attributes for a commercial district, enhancing character and charm. So we as staff, we would agree with the applicant's sentiments that the goal of sign regulations should be to cultivate an attractive urban environment which suits community character. So for those reasons, we believe G very much supports the variance. Criterion H, lastly, is any other relevant factor. We believe there are some that support the variance. The 2023 Oxford Tomorrow Comprehensive Plan was adopted by Council in January, lists a number of goals and objectives to improve quality of life and economic vitality in the city. This includes enhancing the built environment by encouraging adaptive reuse in buildings of special architectural or historic value, which this building certainly does have that value. Approving the 2 requested variances would help support a new business startup in alignment with these city goals. So overall, we believe there is more than substantial evidence to support the 2 requested variances, and I'm happy to take any questions.
The Historic Commission's COA, Certificate of Approval of the sign, what does it speak to specifically about the sign?
I believe that approval was administrative, so it didn't go to the full board. It would have been something that our Historic Commission chair and director would have looked at. There are some guidelines in our historic district guidelines. There's a specific section on signage. I'm not sure I could recite individual provisions from that from memory, but there are some.
Does the COA speak to the placement, size?
I think it's everything. It's all encompassing.
The design and color.
The design, the color, the placement. I think it speaks to all of those qualities.
The placement.
Yes.
All questions, Phil?
Yeah, that's it.
Any other questions?
No.
Thank you.
Speaking for the applicant. And before I swear you in, I need to inform you, since we are short one member, it takes a vote of 3 positive votes for each of the variances. You have the right, since we're not a full board, to request a postponement until next month, or we can go through it with the 4 members if that's approved.
We're okay with just 4, thank you.
Okay. Please, do you swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and matter before this board.
I do.
Please state your name and dating for the record, please.
My name is Genevieve Garenz, and I'm the co-owner of JG Jewelry LLC, and we are applying as tenants of this property.
Please, go ahead.
Our initial comments are more that we want to host a space that kind of curates intermingling between the campus and the uptown area, and we want to invite more students into the uptown area in other manners that don't involve bars. So we're hoping that we get a variance that will kind of attract students to this area without it being under a certain set of pretenses, I suppose. I'm going to open to any questions.
Questions?
No questions.
Cal?
No. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, I accept the motion to move from adjudication back to regular session. So moved.
So moved. Or second.
We move to second. All approved, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are back in regular session. Okay, in the first variance under code 1151.05A1A, and recommending, or in looking at the hanging sign that is the wall, are there any comments, questions?
No.
Well, I would accept the motion on the variance application, please.
I would move that to support the request. I see no objection to criteria A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and H.
Heard a motion, do I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to accept the variance for code 1151.05A1A. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Conrad,
Yes.
Mr. Russo,
No.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
and Mr. Ames.
Yes. With 3 positive votes, it is approved. On the second variance on 1151.05A1A1B, from the minimum height from the ground be 9 feet to an accepted 7 foot from the porch floor, 9 foot from the ground, almost 9 foot from the ground. Questions, comments? I would accept the motion on the second variance.
I move that we accept the second variance with the sign height from the ground, 7 feet from the porch floor.
Second.
Been moved and seconded, we accept or grant the variance from the height. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Conrad,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Russo,
No.
and Mr. Ames.
Yes. There again, with 3 positive votes, the variance is granted. Any other business before the board?
We do not have any further business.
Move to adjourn. We move to adjourn, second?
Second.
Move to second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Meeting is adjourned. Say aye or stand up and leave.
See you, gentlemen.